There is a particular kind of exhaustion that no one warns you about. Not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little, but the exhaustion that comes from thinking too much, feeling too deeply, and seeing too clearly in a world that rewards neither. You have felt it. That moment in a conversation when everyone around you is laughing at something that feels hollow to you, and you are standing there present in body, absent in spirit, wondering why you cannot simply enjoy what everyone else enjoys. Why the simplest interactions carry so much weight inside your mind. Why a single sentence someone said 3 days ago still lives rent-free in your consciousness, turning itself over and over, revealing new angles, new meanings, new wounds. They call it being a deep thinker, and from the outside, it sounds like a gift. People say things like, "You're so intelligent, you see things others miss, you're so profound." What they do not see is what happens after the conversation ends. What happens at 2 in the morning when your mind refuses to be quiet? What happens when your depth becomes the very thing that isolates you from the world you are trying to understand? Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And perhaps that is the real curse of the deep thinker, not that you think too much, but that you see yourself too clearly. Every contradiction, every unresolved wound, every unlived version of who you could have been. This is not a video about celebrating depth. This is about what depth actually costs, and whether knowing everything it takes from you, you would still choose to see the world the way you do. There is a library inside you that never closes. Every experience you have ever had, every conversation, every loss, every moment of unexpected beauty has been catalogued, cross-referenced, and stored somewhere in the architecture of your mind. While others move through life collecting moments, you collect meanings. While others forget, you metabolize. Nothing passes through you without leaving something behind. And for a long time, you probably thought this made you richer than everyone else. In some ways, it does. You notice things. A shift in someone's tone before they say the words. The exact moment a room changes energy. The sadness underneath someone's humor. You read between lines that most people do not even know exist. You feel literature and music and art not as entertainment but as recognition, as if someone, somewhere, finally said what you had been carrying silently for years. But here is what no one tells you about living at that depth. The same sensitivity that allows you to feel beauty more completely also allows you to feel pain more completely. You cannot selectively deepen only the pleasant experiences. Depth is not a dial you turn up for joy and down for suffering. It is a permanent orientation toward reality, and reality, as any honest person will tell you, contains as much darkness as light. The philosopher Schopenhauer believed that intelligence was, in a fundamental sense, a burden. That the more clearly a mind perceives the world, its chaos, its indifference, its suffering, the heavier existence becomes. He was not romanticizing misery. He was observing something precise. That consciousness, at its most expanded, confronts truths that a quieter mind never has to face. Most people are protected by a kind of mental mercy, the inability to see too far, feel too much, question too deeply. The deep thinker has no such protection. This is the first dark side that no one speaks about honestly. Not that deep thinkers are smarter or more evolved, but that they are more exposed to the weight of their own perceptions, exposed to questions that do not resolve, exposed to a kind of loneliness that is not about being alone, but about being unable to be fully met because the conversations you most need to have are the ones that most people are not equipped or willing to have with you. Think about the last time you tried to express something you genuinely felt. Not a surface feeling, but something real, something layered. And the person across from you gave you a response that was technically correct, but completely missed what you were actually saying. That gap between what you expressed and what was received, that is where the deep thinker lives. Permanently, not occasionally, always. Jung described this condition with characteristic precision. He wrote about the sensation of carrying something inside oneself that feels too large for the container of ordinary conversation. The ideas, the perceptions, The feelings, they are not wrong. They are simply too much for the channels that everyday life provides. And so the deep thinker learns, slowly and painfully, to compress, to translate, to offer a smaller, more digestible version of what they actually think, so that the conversation can continue, so that the relationship can survive, so that they themselves do not become too much for the people they love. The tragedy is not that they do this. The tragedy is how natural it eventually feels, how seamlessly the compression becomes habit. How many deep thinkers walk through entire decades of their lives, never once being fully known, not because no one wanted to know them, but because they stopped believing it was possible. That is where this story begins. Not with a diagnosis, not with a theory, but with a feeling you have probably carried for years without having the language for it. You have always been too much and never enough simultaneously, and you have never quite understood why. There is a moment that every deep thinker knows intimately. You are about to make a decision, it does not matter how small. A response to a message, a choice between two paths, a conversation you need to have. And instead of simply acting, your mind opens every possible angle simultaneously. You see the consequences before the action. You feel the aftermath before the event. You are living three versions of the future at the same time, and none of them feel certain enough to move toward. From the outside, this looks like hesitation. From the inside, it is something far more exhausting. It is the complete inability to unknow what you know. Because the deep thinker's mind does not process a situation once and release it. It processes it, then reprocesses it, then examines the reprocessing, then questions whether the examination itself was flawed. It is a recursion that has no natural stopping point, a loop that only ends when the body finally forces the mind into sleep, and even then, not always. Psychologists call this analysis paralysis, but that clinical phrase does not capture the lived texture of it. It is not simply that you analyze too much. It is that your analysis is often correct, and that is precisely what makes it so disabling. You are not catastrophizing irrationally. You are seeing real complexity, real risk, real nuance that genuinely exists. The problem is not that your perception is wrong. The problem is that perception without resolution becomes its own prison. Nietzsche understood this better than most. He wrote about the danger of looking too long into the abyss, that the abyss eventually looks back. What he meant, stripped of its poetry, is that sustained confrontation with the deepest layers of reality begins to change the person doing the confronting. You cannot spend years examining darkness, complexity, and uncertainty without those things leaving a mark on how you see everything else. The deep thinker who has stared long enough into their own questions begins to develop a relationship with doubt that ordinary functioning finds difficult to accommodate. And then there is the pattern recognition, which sounds again like a gift, and it is, until it is not. Deep thinkers see patterns compulsively, in behavior, in language, in history, in relationships. They notice when something that is being presented as new is actually a repetition of something old. They catch the contradiction between what someone says and how they say it. They track the arc of situations before those situations have fully unfolded. This is enormously useful in certain contexts. In others, it is quietly devastating. Because when you see patterns this clearly, you also begin to see endings before they arrive. You feel the distance growing in a relationship weeks before the other person acknowledges it. You recognize the familiar shape of a situation that has already hurt you once, now approaching again in slightly different clothing. Not suspect, not fear, but genuinely know how certain things are going to unfold. And you have to choose every single time whether to say what you see or protect the present moment by staying silent. Most deep thinkers learn to stay silent, not out of cowardice, but out of experience. They have said what they saw before. They have named the pattern, identified the trajectory, articulated the concern, and been told they were overthinking, being too sensitive, creating problems that did not exist. And then, weeks or months later, exactly what they saw came to pass. And there was no satisfaction in being right. There was only the particular loneliness of having been dismissed for seeing clearly. This is the second dark corridor of the deep thinking mind. Not the depth itself, but what the depth shows you that you cannot unsee. The futures you perceive before they happen. The truths you carry alone because no one around you is ready to hold them with you. The mind that cannot stop is not broken. It is simply paying a price that most people never have to pay. There is a specific kind of loneliness that has no adequate word in the English language. It is not the loneliness of being alone. Deep thinkers are often surrounded by people, friends, family, colleagues who genuinely care about them. It is not social isolation in any clinical sense. It is something more precise and more difficult to articulate. It is the loneliness of being fundamentally untranslatable, of carrying an interior life so layered, so continuously active, so dense with perception and feeling and unresolved questioning that the distance between what you experience inside and what you can successfully communicate outside feels, on certain days, like an uncrossable distance. You can be in a room full of people who love you and feel it completely. That is the particular cruelty of this loneliness. It does not respond to company. It does not resolve with connection. Because the problem is not the absence of people, it is the absence of depth in the exchange. And that is something you cannot ask for directly, without sounding arrogant, without implying that the people around you are somehow insufficient, which is not what you mean at all. What you mean is something quieter and more painful than that. You mean that you are hungry for a kind of conversation that almost never happens, and you have been hungry for a very long time. The philosopher Gabriel Marcel made a distinction that cuts directly to this experience. He separated loneliness from solitude, arguing that solitude is a chosen, generative state, while loneliness is an unchosen condition of disconnection. The deep thinker often lives in a painful oscillation between the two. They retreat into solitude because it is the only place where their interior life can breathe without translation. But solitude, extended too long, slides into loneliness. And then they re-enter the world seeking connection, only to find that the connection available rarely reaches the depth they actually need. This dynamic creates something that Jung would recognize as a shadow pattern. Because when the deep thinker cannot find genuine connection externally, they do not simply accept the absence, they internalize it. They begin to read the unavailability of depth around them as evidence of something wrong with themselves. The hunger for real conversation becomes, over time, a quiet belief that they are too much, that their interior life is somehow disordered, that the right response to their own depth is not to seek a match for it, but to reduce it to become smaller, simpler, more digestible, so that belonging becomes possible. And this is where the real darkness lives. Not in the thinking itself, not in the sensitivity, or the pattern recognition, or the analysis, but in what the deep thinker does to themselves in response to a world that cannot consistently meet them. The slow, almost imperceptible process of self-erasure, the careful management of how much they reveal, the performance of lightness when they feel everything but light, the gradual substitution of the self that actually exists with a version that is easier for others to be around. Sartre wrote that hell is other people, and that line has been quoted so often, it has lost its precision. What Sartre actually meant was not that people are inherently terrible, but that the experience of being seen and defined by others, of having your infinite interior reduced to what someone else can perceive and categorize, that reduction is its own kind of suffering. The deep thinker knows this suffering intimately. They have spent years being categorized, overthinking, sensitive, intense, too serious. And each categorization is a small violence not because it is entirely wrong, but because it is so catastrophically incomplete. The loneliness of the deep thinker is the loneliness of someone who has never been fully seen, who has offered pieces of themselves and had those pieces misread, oversimplified, or gently deflected, who has learned through repetition, that full visibility is a risk that rarely pays off the way you hope it will. And still, and this is the part that matters, they keep reaching. Imperfectly, guardedly, with all their accumulated scar tissue intact. They keep reaching. At some point, every deep thinker arrives at a crossroads that no one prepares them for. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no single conversation, no particular crisis, no obvious turning point that announces itself clearly. It arrives quietly, usually in the middle of an ordinary day, as a question that has been building for years finally becomes impossible to ignore. The question is this: is the depth worth it? Not philosophically, not abstractly, but personally, specifically in the actual life you are living. Is the capacity to feel everything, see everything, question everything, is it worth the isolation it creates, the exhaustion it generates, the distance it places between you and the simpler satisfactions that seem to come so naturally to everyone else? This is not a question with a clean answer, and anyone who offers you one is not taking the question seriously enough. What is true is this: the deep thinker cannot choose to become a shallow thinker any more than someone can choose to become colorblind. The architecture is already built, the sensitivity is already wired. The patterns are already being recognized, whether you want them to be or not. So the question is never really whether to keep the depth. The depth is not optional. The question is what you decide to do with the suffering that accompanies it. Whether you carry it as evidence of your brokenness, or whether you begin slowly, imperfectly, to carry it as evidence of your particular way of being alive. Jung spent the final decades of his life working on a concept he called individuation. The process, as he described it, was not about becoming happy in any conventional sense. It was about becoming whole, and wholeness, Jung was careful to clarify, includes the darkness. It includes the exhaustion, the loneliness, the paralysis, the pattern recognition that shows you things you would sometimes prefer not to see. Integration does not mean elimination. It means you stop fighting the parts of yourself that make your life more difficult and begin instead to understand what they are asking of you. The deep thinker's darkness is asking something specific. It is asking you to stop pretending that depth is only valuable when it is comfortable, to stop apologizing for the intensity of your interior life, to stop compressing yourself into shapes that fit more easily into spaces that were never designed for someone like you. This is not a call to isolation or arrogance. It is a call to honesty. The radical, deeply uncomfortable honesty of acknowledging that you are not too much. You are exactly as much as you are. And the work is not to reduce that. The work is to find or build the contexts where that fullness has somewhere to go. Because here is what the deep thinker's suffering, at its most honest, is pointing toward. Not toward despair, toward discernment. The exhaustion of being perpetually misunderstood is not evidence that connection is impossible. It is information about where you have been looking for it. The paralysis of overthinking is not evidence that your mind is broken. It is a signal that you have been trying to resolve through thinking what can only be resolved through living. The loneliness that does not respond to company is not evidence that you are fundamentally alone. It is a compass pointing toward the specific quality of connection you actually need, as opposed to the approximations you have been settling for. Viktor Frankl wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning, not a solution, not a resolution, a meaning. The deep thinker who can look at everything their depth has cost them, the sleepless nights, the compressed conversations, the years of feeling simultaneously too much and never enough, and find within all of it a thread of meaning, is not someone who has escaped their darkness. They are someone who has learned to carry it without being destroyed by it. That is not a small thing. In a world that moves fast and rewards surfaces, the willingness to go deep, to stay with questions that do not resolve, to feel what is actually there rather than what is comfortable, is a form of courage that rarely gets named as such. You have been practicing that courage your entire life. Mostly without knowing it, mostly without anyone telling you that is what it was. And that brings us to something worth sitting with before this conversation ends. Leave a comment below with one word, just one, the word that describes what it feels like to live inside a mind like yours. Not an explanation, not a paragraph, one word. You will find that others have left the same word. And in that small moment of recognition, you will understand something that this entire video has been pointing toward. You are not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. You have simply been looking for your people in places where they were unlikely to gather. If this video reached something in you that most conversations never do, share it with one person. Not to explain yourself to them, not to say this is me, but because somewhere in your life there is someone else carrying the same weight in silence. And sometimes the most generous thing a deep thinker can do is hold up a light for someone who is still trying to find the language for what they feel. Subscribe if you want encore of this. Not motivational content, not quick answers, just honest, unhurried conversations about the parts of human experience that most people talk around rather than through. That is what this channel is. That is what it will remain. And if you have made it here genuinely all the way through, then you already know something about yourself. You are someone who stays with difficult things, who does not flinch when the conversation gets uncomfortable, who would rather feel the full weight of something true than the comfortable lightness of something easy. That is not a small thing to be. Now you know.